Nora Renner was 25 the day they handed her a cardboard box in the glass conference room of the company her own grandfather built. She looked down into it. And there, sitting on top of a stapler she'd never asked to keep, was her nameplate, the brass one. The R her grandfather had filed by hand. Someone had already peeled it off her desk before the meeting even started. They'd unscrewed it. They'd set it in the box. They'd planned this down to the last screw. And Nora Renner did not cry. Her father sat at the head of the table. Gerald Renner, chairman. The man who taught her to read a bill of lading before she could ride a bike. He didn't blink when he said it. He said it flat, the way you read a weather report. "You don't have the stomach for this business, Nora. You never will." While he was still talking, her badge went dead in her pocket. They deactivated it mid-sentence. And out on the warehouse floor, 40 people she had worked beside for years stood watching through the glass as two men in gray shirts walked her to the door. So here's what I'll tell you. I took the one thing they let me keep, my grandfather's nameplate, and I drove straight across town to our biggest competitor's parking lot, and I sat in that lot with the engine off until the doors opened in the morning. That's where this starts. That's not where it ends. If anyone ever told you you'd be nothing without them, this story is for you. Before we go on, do me one favor. Subscribe, so you see how this ends, and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. Go ahead, drop it right now. Then come back, because you're going to want to see what she did next. Now let me take you back. All the way back. Because to understand what she took, you have to understand what they took first. Renner Industrial Supply sat on the north edge of Marlow, Ohio, a building products distributor in a town of maybe 11,000 people. It moved lumber and fasteners and drywall and roofing to every contractor within 100 miles. Nora's grandfather started it out of a single leased bay in 1961 with 2 trucks and a handshake. By the time Nora was born, it filled 4 warehouses and employed most of the neighborhood. The name meant something in Marlow. It was on Little League jerseys. It was on the side of the trucks that rolled out at 5 in the morning. It was, everyone agreed, a good family name. Nora learned the business from the floor up. Not from a corner office. From the floor. She was 12 years old the first time Walt Osai handed her a clipboard and told her to count stock. Walt was the warehouse foreman, a broad, patient man who'd worked for her grandfather since before her father took over. He didn't baby her. He walked her down the racks, aisle by aisle, and he taught her the SKUs like a second language. 1/2-inch galvanized, 3/4 ply, number 2 pine, kiln dried. She learned which items walked out the door in spring and which ones sat dead all winter. She learned the smell of a warehouse in July and the ache of a warehouse in January. By 15, she knew every driver's name and every driver's kid's name. By 17, she was reconciling the morning manifests faster than the men twice her age. She wasn't playing at it. She loved it. She loved the weight of a full pallet, and the sound of the dock doors rolling up, and the particular satisfaction of a truck leaving, loaded exactly right. Nothing missing, nothing short. She gave her whole 20s to that place. While her friends were chasing cities, she was on the loading dock at dawn, when a key account threatened to walk. A regional builder that made up almost 1/5 of the revenue, it was Nora who drove out to the man's job site, in the mud, in the rain, and sat in his trailer and listened for 2 hours, and figured out what had gone wrong, and fixed it herself. She saved that account. She saved several. She built relationships the hard way, one late night at a time, because she believed something simple, and it turned out dangerous. She believed that if she was good enough, her own family would see it. She believed competence was its own reward. She believed the work would speak for her. The work never got the chance. Because there was a plan, and the plan was not her. The plan was Preston. Preston Renner was Nora's older brother, and Preston was the heir. Everyone knew it, and nobody said it out loud, which is the loudest way to know a thing. Preston had the name and the jaw and the golf handicap. What Preston did not have was a single morning of real time on the floor. He'd never counted stock in his life. He'd never smelled a January warehouse. He wanted the throne, and he wanted it clean, without the part where you earn it. And their father, Gerald, looked at his son and saw a future, and looked at his daughter and saw, at best, a very reliable employee. It started small. It always starts small. That signature account, the regional builder Nora had personally saved in the mud and the rain, Gerald reassigned it. Quietly, no meeting, no announcement. He handed it to Preston to give the boy some seasoning. Nora found out when she saw Preston's name on the account file where hers used to be. She went to her father. She kept her voice even. She said she'd been the one to save that relationship, that the builder trusted her, that this was a mistake. Gerald didn't even look up from his desk. He said Preston needed the wins. He said it would be good for him. He said, "You'll have plenty of accounts, Nora, as if the one you bled for and the one you're handed are the same thing. As if the work were interchangeable." Then it got worse, and it got worse in the exact way that hurts most. A month later, there was a leadership review, and Preston stood up in front of the senior team and presented a turnaround on that very account, the recovery in the numbers, the renewed contract, the growth. He presented it as his own. Every figure on those slides was Nora's. Every late night, every trailer meeting, every concession she'd negotiated in the rain. Preston stood up there in a good suit and took the credit for all of it. And their father nodded, pleased, proud, and said, "Good work, son." Nora sat in that room and said nothing. What was there to say? If she stood up and claimed it, she was the bitter sister. If she stayed quiet, she disappeared. There was no version of that moment where the truth got to win. She dug her nails into her own palm under the table, and she stayed quiet. And something small and load-bearing inside her went quiet with her. That was the first wound. No witnesses, just her and the knowing. The second wound had a witness, and that made it a different kind of wound. There was a leadership offsite a few weeks after that, a retreat at a lodge 2 hours out of Marlow, the kind with whiteboards and bad coffee and men in quarter zips talking about synergy. Nora had prepared for weeks. She'd built a real plan, a turnaround for the whole distribution operation, tighter inventory, better routing, a way to claw back margin that the firm had been leaking for years without noticing. She knew the floor better than any of them. Her plan was good. Her plan was, honestly, the best thing in the room. And she knew it. And for one foolish minute, she let herself believe that this time the work would speak. She got about 90 seconds in. She was mid-sentence, laying out the inventory piece, when her father cut her off. Just cut right across her. "We're not reinventing the warehouse, Nora. Let's move on." And he moved on. To Preston. To something smaller and worse. Across the table sat Marcus Vane. Vane was Gerald's prot, the chief financial officer, a lean, careful man who'd hitched his whole career to the Renner name and knew exactly which way the power ran. Vane had seen Nora's plan. He knew it was good. He'd said so privately, weeks earlier. And in that room, when Gerald cut her off, Marcus Vane looked down at his notepad and said, absolutely nothing. He let it happen. He was loyal to power, not to the numbers. And in that silence, Nora understood something about how the whole building really worked. It was at that same offsite, in a hallway conversation she wasn't really part of, that Nora overheard the things she would carry for 10 years without knowing yet what it was worth. Two of the finance people were talking about the company's debt, about the senior facility. $47 million, borrowed against the whole operation, with covenants, the conditions a lender attaches, the tripwires that let them seize control if the company steps wrong. One of them laughed and said, "Dad never read the fine print on that thing. He had people for that." Meaning Gerald. Meaning her father had signed $47 million of obligations and left the reading to somebody else. Nora filed it away without meaning to. The way you remember a smell. 47 million. Tight covenants. Nobody in the family actually reading them. It didn't mean anything to her yet. It was just a fact, sitting in a drawer in the back of her mind, next to the brass nameplate on her desk, her grandfather's R, filed by hand. The one thing in that whole glass building that felt like it was actually hers. She should have seen the big one coming. Looking back, she probably did, the way you can feel weather before it turns. But you don't let yourself believe your own family will do the thing. You keep working. You keep believing the work will speak. Right up until the morning it doesn't. They called it a restructuring. That word, restructuring, it's a clean word. It's a word with no blood on it. It's the word you use when you've decided to cut someone and you'd like everyone to agree it was just math. There was a board meeting scheduled, and Nora was told to attend, and she walked into that glass conference room that morning with a folder of her own work under her arm. Still, God help her, half believing she was there to contribute. The box was already on the table. She saw it before she sat down. A plain cardboard box, and on top of it, her nameplate, the brass R, unscrewed from her desk, sitting there in full view. They hadn't even waited. They'd taken it off her desk before she arrived, so it would be waiting for her when she walked in. That's the detail I keep coming back to. The planning of it, the cruelty of the small, decided in advance gesture. Her father sat at the head of the table. Preston sat at his right hand already, like a coronation. Marcus Vane sat with his careful eyes down, and around the table sat the board, including her Aunt Delia. Delia Renner was the quiet one. Her grandfather's other line, a minority shareholder, a woman who held a small stake and a long memory, and rarely said much in meetings. But she was watching now. She was watching Nora, and she was watching the box, and something in her face had gone very still and very hard. Gerald did it without ceremony, which was its own insult. He said the company was streamlining. He said certain roles were being eliminated to make the organization leaner. He said Nora's position, specifically, was one of them. He talked about her in the third person while she sat 6 feet away, as if she'd already left the room. And then he looked at her, finally, directly, and he delivered the line. Flat, certain, in front of all of them. You don't have the stomach for this business, Nora. You never will. While he was saying it, while the words were still in the air, her phone buzzed once against the table. Her building access, deactivated, they'd timed it. They'd actually timed the deactivation of her badge to the meeting, so that by the time the sentence ended, she was already, technically, no longer allowed inside. 2 men from security appeared at the glass door. Not because she'd made a scene, she hadn't moved, but because the plan called for an escort. And the plan was the plan. Out on the floor, work stopped. 40 people, drivers, pickers, the office staff, people who had known Nora since she was 12, counting stock with Walt, stood and watched through the glass wall as the founder's granddaughter was walked out of the founder's company carrying a box with her own nameplate in it. Walt Osai was out there. She found his eyes for half a second. He looked like he'd been struck. There was a vote. A formality, really, the outcome already decided. And when it came around the table, one voice said no. One, Aunt Delia Renner, small and steady, said no in a voice that didn't shake, and let it sit there in the room like a stone. It changed nothing. But Nora heard it. 10 years later, she would still hear it. And Nora Renner did not cry. Not in that room. She stood up. She picked up the box. She held it the way you hold something you're not going to give the satisfaction of dropping. And she walked out through the glass, past the 40 faces, past Walt, out into the parking lot where her car was, because they'd already keyed her out of the reserved spot, so she'd parked it that morning like a visitor without knowing why. She sat in her car in the lot of the company her grandfather built. She put the box on the passenger seat. She took the brass nameplate out of it and held it in both hands. The R her grandfather had filed by hand, warm now from her palms, and she looked at it for a long time. And then she did the thing I told you she did. She started the engine. She drove across Marlow, across town, to the industrial road on the far side, where their single biggest competitor kept its yard. Halvorson Building Supply. The rival, the enemy, the name her father spat at dinner. She pulled into their parking lot. She turned the engine off. And she sat there, with the nameplate on the dash, watching the dark windows. And she waited for morning, and for the doors to open, and for the whole rest of her life to start. Here's what her father didn't understand, sitting at the head of that table. He thought he was ending something. He thought a person is only what you let them be inside your building. He'd handed her a box and mistaken it for the end of her. It was the beginning of the meter that would swallow him whole. But that part comes later. First, she had to become nothing to strangers. The doors of Halvorson Building Supply opened at 7. Nora was in the lobby at 7:02, still in yesterday's clothes, the nameplate left in the glove box where nobody could see it. She asked to speak to whoever did the hiring. Not to the owner. Not to the top. She wasn't there to trade on the Renner name. The Renner name, in this building, was the enemy's name anyway. She was there to start over. And when the operations manager came out, a skeptical man with reading glasses pushed up on his head and asked what she was looking for. She told him the truth. She said she knew distribution. She said she knew it from the floor. She said she'd take whatever was open and prove the rest. What was open was low, a coordinator role, inventory, and dispatch, a full rung. More than a rung, below where she'd been. The pay was a fraction. The desk was a folding table in a shared room. And her name meant nothing there. That was the cost, and it was a real one. And I want you to sit with it. Because this is the part the highlight reels skip. For a solid year, Nora Renner was underestimated by everyone in that building. To them, she was just the quiet new coordinator who worked strange hours and knew the racks a little too well. Nobody knew who she was. Nobody cared. She was, in the only way that the world was measuring her that year, nothing. She kept the nameplate in a drawer. She didn't put it on the desk. It wasn't time. And she went to work. Not to be seen, she'd learned exactly where that gets you. She went to work to become undeniable. She learned Halvorson's operation the same way she'd learned her grandfather's, aisle by aisle, driver by driver, except now she was learning how a competitor thought, how a different company solved the same problems, where the money actually leaked and where it actually pooled. She stopped assuming the work would speak. She started making sure it did, quietly in results, in numbers that were hard to argue with. She fixed a routing problem in her first 90 days that had been costing them real money for years. The man with the reading glasses noticed. He didn't say much, but he started giving her harder things. The pain didn't vanish. Let me be honest with you about that. Some morning she sat in that same parking lot before the doors opened and felt the whole thing again. The box, the glass, the 40 faces, her father's flat voice. But slowly, across that year, the feeling changed shape. Pain has a way of hardening into something more useful if you keep moving through it. The hurt cooled into resolve. She stopped replaying the boardroom to feel the wound and started replaying it to study it. What had actually happened to her in that room? Not cruelty, though it was cruel. Control. Her father held the building and the name and the board, and she'd held nothing but her own competence. And competence with no leverage behind it is just a talent you're allowed to donate to people who despise you. She understood that now. She'd never make that mistake again. It was a woman from a fund who found her. About a year into Halvorson, a mid-market investment firm was doing diligence on a distribution deal in the region. A private equity and turnaround shop, the kind that buys struggling industrial businesses, fixes them, and sells them. They were poking around the sector, talking to operators, and someone told them, if you want to understand distribution in this part of Ohio, talk to the new coordinator over at Halvorson, because she knows things a coordinator shouldn't know. A partner came out to meet her expecting an hour. They talked for 3. Nora walked that woman through the economics of a regional distributor, margin. Inventory turns, the covenants on the debt. The difference between a business that's failing and a business that's just badly run, with a fluency that stopped the partner cold. Anybody can learn finance from a book. Almost nobody can also tell you, from having stood on the dock at 5 in the morning, exactly why the book is wrong. They offered her a job, not a coordinator's job, an associate seat at the fund, in the industrial turnaround group, doing the things she was built for without knowing it, going into broken distributors and fixing them. She took it. It was the second rung of the climb, and this one went up. Now she was on the other side of the table. Now she was learning the machinery of control itself. How you buy a company, how debt works, senior and junior, and what a covenant really is. Not the abstract thing she'd overheard in a hallway years ago, but the live wire of it. The exact tripwires that hand a lender the keys. She learned what happens when a company borrows more than it can carry, and then stumbles. She learned that the fine print her father never read is where companies actually live or die. Every day at that fund, without anyone teaching it as a lesson, she was learning the precise mechanism by which a family could lose the thing it thought it owned forever. Her first control deal was a broken regional distributor 2 states over. A good business underneath, drowning in bad management, and a debt load it couldn't service. The fund put Nora on it because she understood the floor and the finance both, and she went in and she did the hard thing. She fixed it. And fixing it meant a cost that taught her more than any win. She had to right-size a plant, which is the clean phrase for the thing that isn't clean at all. She had to look at real people, on a real floor. People not so different from Walt and the driver she'd grown up with, and make decisions about a facility that had 2 more of something than it could afford. She lost sleep over it. She did it anyway, and she did it as humanely as the numbers would allow. And she learned the weight of holding control. That control isn't the fun of ordering people around. It's the burden of being the one the consequences land on. She learned covenants the hard way on that deal. 2. A near miss. A breach that almost tripped. A lender that almost took the wheel. And Nora in the middle of it, curing it, negotiating it, feeling in her own hands exactly how a $47 million tripwire would feel if someone were standing on the wrong side of it. She filed that away too, right next to the nameplate. She delivered the fix. The distributor came back to life, the fund made its return, and Nora Renner was made a principal. Not a coordinator anymore, not an associate, a principal, with a voice in what the fund bought and how. 5 years, maybe 6, out from the box in the glass room, she had become one of the people who decides which companies get saved and who gets to keep them. She had, without ever saying the word out loud, become exactly the kind of person who could take a company away from a family that couldn't hold it. Somewhere in those years, the pain finished its work. It wasn't a wound she carried anymore. It was a blade she'd learned to use. And I want to be careful here, because this isn't a story about a woman poisoned by revenge. It's a story about a woman who took the exact thing that was done to her, the lesson that competence without leverage is worthless, and refused to be its victim twice. She wasn't bitter. She was ready. There's a difference, and the difference is everything, and you'll see it when we get to the end. Which brings us to the day the whole thing turned. The day she stopped fixing other people's companies and decided to build the instrument for the only company that ever mattered. She'd been carrying a thesis around in her head for months, a pattern she kept seeing in the sector, deal after deal. Family-owned mid-market distributors, regional, decades old, built by a founder, run now by a 2nd or 3rd generation, that had borrowed too much and understood their own debt too little. Businesses with good bones and bad stewardship. Companies exactly like the one she grew up in. She'd watched a dozen of them wobble. She knew, better than any spreadsheet could tell her, why they wobbled, because she'd been raised inside one and thrown out of it. And she knew something the market didn't fully price, that these companies were fragile in a very specific way. One overexpansion, one bad year, one covenant nobody in the family had actually read. And the whole thing tips into someone else's hands. So she raised her own fund. That's the point where a person stops reacting and starts acting. And I want you to notice it. Because everything before this was Nora surviving what was done to her. And everything after this is Nora doing. She went out and she raised capital. Her own vehicle, her own thesis, her own name on the door this time. A fund aimed squarely at exactly that kind of business. Over-leveraged, family-owned, mid-market industrial distributors. She built the machine. And then she sat down with the tracking sheet, the working list of targets that fit the thesis, the companies the fund would watch and wait on, and be ready for the day they stumbled. And at the top of that sheet, in her own hand, she wrote one name. Renner, not out of rage. Understand that. She wrote it the way a surgeon circles the thing on the scan. Renner Industrial Supply fit the thesis perfectly. Family-owned, mid-market, distribution, and by everything she was hearing from back home, increasingly overextended under new leadership. It was, on the pure merits, exactly the kind of company her fund existed to take. That it also happened to be the company that handed her a box with her own nameplate in it. Well, she could hold both of those truths at once now. She'd learned how. The professional and the personal had finally, after 10 years, pointed at the same door. She didn't call anyone. She didn't announce anything. She just put the name at the top of the sheet. And she started to watch. And she started to wait. And back in Marlow, Ohio, in the glass building her grandfather built, her brother Preston was about to do something with the company that would put a $47 million tripwire directly under his own feet. He just didn't know it yet. And neither did their father. And the woman who did know, the only person in the whole story who understood exactly what was coming and exactly what it was worth, was sitting 2 states away with a fund behind her and a brass nameplate in her drawer, waiting for the sound of the fine print no one had read finally coming due. Because here's the thing about a company that borrows $47 million and doesn't read the covenants. It works fine. It works fine right up until the day it doesn't. And the day it doesn't, someone has to come up with the money to save it. Someone with capital. Someone patient. Someone who's been ready for exactly this for 10 long years. Preston was about to go looking for that someone. He was about to send the company's rescue, blind, straight into the arms of the sister he helped throw out. But that's the next part of the story, and you're going to want to be here for it. She'd built the fund on a single sentence. Family-owned distributors that borrowed more than they understood. That was the whole thesis. Investors liked it because it was clean. It was also, though none of them knew it, a knife with one name carved into the handle. For a while, nothing happened. That's the part they never tell you about waiting. It's mostly nothing. She read quarterly filings that weren't public, but reached her anyway, the way things do when you've spent 10 years building the kind of relationships that carry paper. She watched Renner Industrial from a distance, the way you watch weather. And then Preston did the thing. She'd known he would. She just hadn't known what shape it would take. It turned out to be warehouses. 4 of them, all at once, in 3 states, financed on top of the debt her father had already stacked. Preston called it a footprint expansion. He gave a speech about it. Somebody sent her the speech. He stood in the loading bay her grandfather poured, and he talked about scale and legacy and the next 50 years. And not one word in it was about whether the numbers held. They didn't hold. Here's what a covenant is, if nobody's ever made you sign one. It's a promise buried in the loan. It says the company will keep certain ratios in certain places. Debt to earnings. Coverage. The boring math. Break the promise, even by an inch, even for a quarter, and the lender can call the whole loan due. $47 million. All at once. Payable now. Preston broke it in the second quarter after the warehouses opened. The revenue he'd promised didn't arrive. The costs he hadn't counted did. And the ratio slipped past the line their father had signed for and never read, because he'd had people for that. And the people were gone, and Preston had never learned to read it either. The bank sent a letter. 90 days to cure, it said. 90 days to raise the money, or restructure the debt, or find someone with capital willing to step in. Otherwise, the loan came due. And a company that can't pay a called loan is a company that belongs to whoever holds the paper. Preston panicked. She heard about that too. He didn't tell the board at first. He told Marcus Vane, and the two of them went looking. Quietly. The way frightened men look for money. They needed a rescue. They needed capital that moved fast and didn't ask the whole town. They needed a fund that specialized in exactly this. Distressed family distributors, mid-market, over-leveraged. There is exactly one such fund within reach of Marlow, Ohio. The call came in through an intermediary. A placement guy in Columbus who didn't know the Renners from anyone. He called it a rescue mandate. He said the family was motivated. He said they'd move on terms. He sent a deck with the company's name on the cover. And the deck landed on the desk of the fund's lead partner. And the lead partner read it in about 4 minutes. And then she sat very still for a long time. Then she picked up the phone and did the second thing. While Preston courted investors he'd never met, Nora went to the secondary market and bought the debt. Not the equity. The debt. The $47 million in senior paper the bank was suddenly very nervous about holding. Banks hate a called loan almost as much as the borrower does. They'll sell it at a discount to be rid of the risk. So she bought it, quietly, through the fund, tranche by tranche, until the paper that controlled Renner Industrial Supply sat inside a vehicle that answered to her. She held the thing itself now. Not a plan to get it. The thing. The family didn't know. That was the strangest part of those weeks. Gerald and Preston sent decks to the investors. They cleaned up the numbers. They rehearsed. Somewhere in a conference room in Marlow, her father practiced sounding confident for a woman he'd told would never make it. And he had no idea it was her. Delia knew something was wrong. Delia always did. She'd voted no 10 years ago, and she'd kept her small stake in her long memory. And when Preston told the board they were in advanced talks with a strategic capital partner, Delia asked one question. She asked who the partner was. Preston said the fund's name. Delia wrote it down. She didn't say anything else. But she wrote it down. The meeting got scheduled for a Tuesday. Term sheet. The room where it happened 10 years ago. The glass conference room. The long table. The floor visible through the wall of windows. Somebody's idea of neutral ground. Except there is no neutral ground in a building your grandfather built. Nora flew in the night before. She stayed at a hotel off the highway, not in town. She laid her suit out on the bed, and she took the brass nameplate out of her bag, and she set it on the desk in the hotel room, and she looked at it for a while. The hand filed R. Her grandfather's thumb had worn a shine into the corner of it over 40 years. She'd kept it in a drawer for 10. Tomorrow it was going back on a table in that building. She didn't rehearse anything. She'd been rehearsing for 10 years. The morning came up gray over Marlow. She drove in past the warehouse where she'd counted stock at 12. The forklifts were already moving. Walt's old radio was probably going somewhere in there. The same country station. 40 people whose jobs were sitting inside a folder in her bag, and none of them knew that either. She parked in the visitor lot. She'd had a badge for this building once, and they'd cut it mid-sentence, and now she signed in at the front desk as a guest, and the young woman at the desk didn't recognize the name because the young woman was new. Nora signed the little book. She clipped on the paper visitor pass. Then, she rode the elevator up to the floor she'd been walked off of a decade before. They were already in the room. She could see them through the glass as she came down the hall. Gerald at the head of the table, older now, thinner, his good suit hanging on him. Preston beside him, too loud already, laughing at something with the placement guy from Columbus. Marcus Vane across from them with his laptop open. And down at the far end, quiet, hands folded, Aunt Delia, who was not supposed to be at this meeting and had come anyway. The placement guy stood up when the door opened. "Here's our partner now," he said. "Gerald, Preston, Let me introduce. And then he stopped. Because he was looking at their faces. Preston saw her first. His laugh died in his throat. Just went out. Like a switch. He half rose out of his chair, and then didn't finish. So he was caught in this crouch, staring. Gerald turned last. He was reaching for the coffee. He turned with the cup in his hand, and he saw his daughter standing in the doorway of the room he'd thrown her out of, in a suit that cost more than his, with a folder under her arm, and the cup stopped halfway to the table. Nobody said anything for a second. The placement guy looked around the room, confused, sensing he'd walked into weather he didn't understand. Nora walked in. She set her folder on the table. She pulled out the chair at the head, the empty one, the one meant for the partner, and she sat down in it, across the long table from her father, and she folded her hands the way Delia was folding hers. "Hello, Dad," she said. Gerald put the cup down without drinking from it. "Nora, Preston," she said. "Marcus, Delia," a small nod to the far end of the table, and only there did anything soften in her face at all, and only for a second. "Thank you all for coming." Preston found his voice. It came out wrong, too high. "What is this? What is this? Is this some kind of—" He looked at the placement guy. "Is this a joke? Did you set this up?" "Sit down, Preston," Nora said. Not loud. She didn't need loud. He sat. The placement guy cleared his throat. Clearly there's history here, so maybe I should." "You can stay," Nora said. "You brought the deal. You should see how it closes." She opened the folder. She didn't rush. She turned it so the top page faced up, and she slid it to the center of the table, one page, and she took the second thing out of her bag and set it down beside the folder. The nameplate, the brass R, standing upright on the conference table, facing her father. Gerald looked at it. He knew exactly what it was. He'd watched his own father file the edge of that R by hand, at a workbench 60 years ago. He looked at it standing on the table, and something moved across his face that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite grief, and he reached, slowly, for his reading glasses. "You'll want those," Nora said. He put them on. He looked down at the page. "Let me save you the reading," she said. "It's a change of control notice. The senior facility, the 47 million, was called when you breached the coverage covenant in the second quarter. You had 90 days to cure. You spent 60 of them looking for a rescue." She let that sit. "You found one. You just didn't look closely enough at who it was." "The fund," Marcus Vane said. He was doing math behind his eyes. She could see it. "The fund is buying the equity." You're recapitalizing," Nora said. "That's the part I want to be very clear about, so nobody signs anything they misunderstand. I'm not here to invest in Renner Industrial." She looked at her father when she said the next part, because he was the one who'd said the sentence 10 years ago, and he was the one who needed to hear this one. "I'm not buying my way back in. I already own the debt. This is just the part where you sign." The room went very quiet. Preston didn't understand it yet. She could see him not understanding it. He was still looking for the trick, the negotiation, the place where he could push back and win the way he'd always won, by being loud and being the heir. "You can't own the debt," he said. "The debt's with the bank." Marcus, tell her. "The debt's with the bank sold it," Marcus said quietly. He'd gotten there. He'd gotten there a full minute before Preston, and he'd gone pale doing it. "When we breached. A bank doesn't hold a defaulted facility, Preston. They offload it. He stopped. He looked at Nora with something that was almost admiration and almost nausea. "How long have you held it?" "Long enough," Nora said. Marcus closed his laptop. That was his whole answer, and it told her everything about Marcus that she'd already known. He'd stayed silent when they cut her off 10 years ago, because power was in the room, and he served power. And now the power had moved to the other end of the table, and Marcus closed his laptop, and she understood she'd never have to worry about Marcus. He'd be loyal to whoever held the paper. That kind of man always is. Preston was still going. The bravado was collapsing, but it collapsed loud. the way a building comes down. You can't just walk in here after 10 years and, Dad, say something. This is our company. This is Grandpa's company. She got fired, she doesn't get to. Preston, Gerald's voice, old and flat. But Preston couldn't stop. He turned on Nora. You think this makes you something? Buying paper? You couldn't run this floor when you were here, you didn't have the... And he stopped himself half a second too late. Because he heard where the sentence was going, and so did everyone else in the room, because it was the sentence their father had said the day they threw her out. Nora finished it for him. Gently, the stomach for it, she said. Go ahead. I've heard it before. She stood up, not to loom, to go to the window. She stood at the glass and looked down at the floor below, at the forklifts and the racking and the men in the aisles, the same floor she'd learned to count at 12 years old. You expanded into 4 warehouses in 3 states, she said, still looking down at the floor, because you wanted a footprint. You put it on top of a senior facility with a coverage covenant set at a level Dad agreed to without reading, because Dad had people for that, and then Dad fired the only person in this family who'd have read it. You needed to clear a coverage ratio you were never going to clear, and when you missed it, you had 90 days, and you spent them hiring a man from Columbus to go find you a fund. She turned around. I am the fund, Preston. There is no rescue party. There was never going to be a rescue party. There was only ever me. Preston's mouth opened, and nothing came out. So here's what happened, she said. And she came back to the table and stood behind her chair with her hands on the back of it. I want to do this cleanly. I'm not interested in a fire sale, and I'm not interested in humiliating anybody in front of the floor. The floor stays. Every job on it. Walt Osei runs the warehouse the way he's run it for 40 years, and he gets a raise. Because he should have had one a decade ago. The name over the door stays Renner, because it's my name too, and it was my grandfather's first. She looked at Preston. You're out of operations. Effective when the ink dries. You keep your shares, they're just worth a lot less than they were on Tuesday. And you keep a title if you want one. Something with no floor under it. Since that's always what you wanted anyway. It wasn't a taunt. It was almost kind. And that was worse. You go find something to consult on. Preston stood up so fast the chair went over behind him, and he walked out. He didn't slam the door. He couldn't even manage that. It just clicked shut behind him. Nora let him go. She'd deal with him in the hallway. She knew she'd have to. She turned to her father. But not yet. That one she'd do alone. Marcus, she said. You'll stay on through the transition. 60 days. After that, we'll talk about whether there's a seat for you. And the honest answer is probably not. And you already know why. Marcus nodded. He'd known before she said it. He gathered his things and he left too, and the room got smaller and quieter. And now it was Nora and Gerald and, at the far end, Delia, who hadn't said a single word the whole time. Nora looked down the table at her aunt. Nora, Delia said. And then, after a moment, the corner of her mouth moved. You took your time. I did. Good, Delia said. Fast would have been cheaper for them. And she folded her hands again and sat back. The minority shareholder who'd cast the only no vote 10 years ago, watching the vote finally come out her way. Nora went out into the hallway. Preston was there, of course, pacing by the elevators, and he came at her the second the door opened, all the old tone back in place, the big brother voice, the one that used to work. You can't just come in here and blow up 30 years of Section 7. 2, Nora said. He stopped. The coverage covenant, she said. It's in Section 7.2 of the credit agreement Dad signed in, I want to say it was a Thursday. Consolidated EBITDA to fixed charges, minimum ratio, tested quarterly. You breached it by a little over 3/10 in Q2. The cure period was 90 days from the notice of default under Section 8.1. That ran out 11 days ago. She said it the way you'd read a grocery list. You had 90 days to find $47 million or negotiate a standstill with the holder of the debt. You did neither, because you never read past the cover page. Same as him. That's not an insult, Preston. It's just what happened. I read it. You didn't. That's the entire story of the last 10 years. Right there in one clause. Preston looked at her. All the noise was gone out of him now. He was just a man in a good suit, standing by an elevator in a building that wasn't his anymore. And he didn't say anything, because there was nothing left to say, and he knew it. The elevator came. He got on it. He wrote it down. Nora went to find her father. She found him where she knew she would, in the corner office that had been his father's, standing at the window with his back to the door. She'd structured this part carefully. This was the one she'd thought about the most, over the years in the quiet before sleep. She'd imagined 100 versions of it, and most of them had been cruel, because for a long time she'd wanted cruelty. And then somewhere in the last few years, she'd stopped wanting it, and she'd realized that the flex, the real one, wasn't the shout. It was the grace. She had 2 folders this time. She set one on the desk. 2 chairs. She sat in one and waited until he sat in the other. I'm not going to do to you what you did to me, she said. There's no meeting downstairs. Nobody's watching through the glass. No security walking you out. She slid the folder across. These are exit terms. You retire. Chairman Emeritus, a real title, on the letterhead, at the galas, all of it. Your pension's protected. I structured it so it can't be touched, not by me, not by anyone after me. You keep the house. You keep your dignity. You leave the way a founder's son should get to leave, and the town never knows it wasn't your idea. Gerald picked up the folder. His hands weren't as steady as they'd been 10 years ago. He put his glasses on again, and he read it. Actually read it this time. Every line. The way he never had with the thing that cost him the company. It took him a while. She let it take a while. When he finished, he set it down. He looked at her, and for the first time in her life, she couldn't read what was in his face, because she'd never seen him wear it before. You had people to read the fine print, Dad, she said. Quiet, not a knife. Just true. I became one of them. He took the pen. He signed. His signature was smaller than it used to be. When he was done, he capped the pen and set it down and looked at the nameplate, which she'd carried in from the conference room and set on the corner of the desk without thinking about it, out of some old habit, because that's where it had always lived. He filed that R himself, Gerald said. Your grandfather. Wouldn't buy a finished one. Said a bought name doesn't mean anything. He stopped. I forgot he said that. I forgot it for a long time. I didn't, Nora said. The signing itself, the formal one, happened 3 days later, in the same glass conference room, in front of the same board that had voted her out. Delia was there in the flesh this time, not on the phone, sitting up straight in her good coat. The lawyers stacked the documents. The change of control went through page by page, witnessed, notarized, lawful, every clause read aloud and initialed. The whole thing so boring and so complete that there was nothing dramatic left in it at all. And that was the point. No violence, no shouting, just paper, doing what paper does when someone finally reads it. When it was done, Delia leaned over to her, under the noise of the lawyers packing up, and said, 10 years ago I raised my hand and said no. And everyone in this room looked at me like I was a sentimental old woman. I remember, Nora said. I wasn't being sentimental, Delia said. I was counting. And she patted Nora's hand once. And that was the whole vindication, 20 seconds of it, 10 years late. And it was enough. A year went by. The light comes up early over the Marlow warehouse in the summer. It comes in low through the high east windows and lands in bars across the concrete, and the dust hangs in it, and the forklifts start moving before the offices are even open. Walt Osie's radio plays the same country station it's played for 40 years, tinny, propped on a shelf by the shipping desk, and Walt himself is out on the floor at 6:30 with a clipboard, calling the day. And every driver who comes through knows his name, and he knows theirs. There's a coffee going cold on a desk in the corner office, because the woman who set it down got pulled onto the floor to look at a racking problem and forgot about it, the way her grandfather used to. And on that desk, standing upright, catching the early light, is a brass nameplate with an R filed by hand. The corner worn to a shine by a thumb that's been gone for years. It's not in a drawer anymore. It's not in a box. It's home. Nora runs it now. Not from 2 states away she comes in. Not every day, but enough. The fund owns the company, and she runs the fund, and the arrangement is clean and lawful and boring, which is exactly how she likes it. The floor kept every job. Walt got the raise. The 4 warehouses got sold off, quietly, at a loss she'd already priced in, and the company got smaller and got healthy, which is a trade Preston never understood and never would. Preston consults now. Somewhere, he put out a shingle, and he gives talks about scale and legacy to rooms that don't know the story, and once in a while one of them finds out and stops returning his calls. And that's his to carry, not hers. Gerald sends a card at the holidays. Just a card. Signed at the bottom in that smaller handwriting. She keeps them in a drawer, a different drawer than the one the nameplate used to live in. She hasn't written back yet. She might. There's time. Marcus Vane called twice in the spring when he heard the fund was raising a second vehicle and thought maybe there was a seat after all. She didn't return either call. Men who are loyal to power always assume the door swings both ways. It doesn't. And Delia's still on the board she never left. She votes on everything, slowly, and she's usually right. And when a young analyst from the fund made the mistake of talking over her in a meeting last fall, Nora let it happen for exactly 4 seconds and then said, "When my aunt is speaking, we listen." And the analyst never did it again. There's a man named Ren Okafor who partners with her at the fund. He came in on the second raise, sharp and easy and unimpressed by the things that are supposed to impress people, which is the rarest quality she knows. He's leaning against the loading dock doorframe this particular morning, waiting, 2 coffees in his hands, because he learned early that she forgets hers. He's not the reason for any of it. He's not part of the story of how she got here. He's just the thing that was waiting at the end of it, which is a different thing entirely, and a better one. She comes across the floor toward him with dust in the light behind her and Walt's radio going and the forklifts moving, and she takes the coffee, and she says something that makes him laugh. And out beyond the open dock door, the town of Marlow, Ohio, is waking up around a company that carries her grandfather's name and, finally, her hand. She thinks about it sometimes, the sentence her father said. "You don't have the stomach for this business. You never will." She thinks about how sure he was, how sure they all were. The whole room of them, 40 people watching through the glass while security cut her badge. They looked at a quiet 25-year-old carrying a cardboard box, and they saw someone who was finished. They just never watched her count stock at 12 years old, on this floor, in this light, learning every SKU and every driver's name from a foreman with a tinny radio. They never saw the part that mattered. They mistook steady for soft. People do that. It's the most expensive mistake there is, and almost nobody learns it until the bill comes due. Hers came due on a Tuesday, with a brass nameplate standing upright on a boardroom table, and a single page slid across, and 6 words that closed a decade. If anyone ever told you you'd be nothing without them, I hope you're still here. And I hope you're watching this from somewhere they said you'd never reach. Tell me where that is. Comment the city you're watching from. I really do want to see how far this one travels.